Translation by John Varghese. George Steiner once said, "All acts of communication are acts of translation." In other words, every act of communication requires translation. If everyone spoke the same language, would that still require translation? The answer is an emphatic yes. That a translation is necessary whether two people converse in the same language or in a different language. Any form of communication, verbal or nonverbal, requires translation. Before we can even learn to formulate words, we learn to communicate. Language can be confusing, and the English language is no different. For example, there is no egg in eggplant, or ham in hamburger, neither apple nor pine in pineapple. English muffins were not invented in England, or French fries in France. Sweetmeats are candies, while sweet breads, which aren't sweet, are meat. We take the English for granted, but if we explore its paradoxes, we can find that quicksand can work slowly. Boxing rings are squares, and a guinea pig is neither from Guinea nor a pig. And why is it that writers write, but fingers don't fing, and grocers don't gross, and hammers don't ham? If plural of tooth is teeth, why isn't the plural of booth beat? One goose, two geese, one moose, two meese. If teachers taught, why didn't preachers prot? If a vegetarian eats vegetables, what does a humanitarian eat? In what language do people recite at a play and play at a recital? Ship by truck and send cargo by ship? Have noses that run and feet that smell? Park on driveways and drive on parkways? How can a slim chance and a fat chance be the same, while a wise man and a wise guy are opposites? When a house burns up, it burns down. You fill in a form by filling it out, and an alarm clock goes off by going on. When the stars are out, they are visible. But when the lights are out, they are invisible. And why is it that when I wind up my watch, I start it, but when I wind up this essay, I end it? These idiosyncrasies are not unique to the English language. Every language has its quirks. Just as real estate is all about location, location, and location, a translation is all about context, context, and context. Context determines the meaning of a word. A translator should not impose his meaning into the text because that would misrepresent the author. Therefore, being faithful to the original text requires being familiar with the signs, dialects, idioms, expressions, and symbols unique to a particular context. A translator later attempts to communicate the meaning of words and phrases from one language to another. Translators also bridge the interpretative, the grammatical, literary, and cultural gaps. Translation and interpretation go hand in hand. Translation and interpretation are like a horse and a carriage. You can't have one without the other. Finding the correct word from a range of possible meanings and plugging in the word is not a translation. It is merely word substitution. The translator should pay attention to the terms and phrases in their context and interpret them before translating them into their receptor language. Context is more than the immediate surrounding of the text. It also has to do with the genre, the author's background, and what it may have meant to the original audience. This requires some knowledge of the history and cultural background. Therefore, translation studies are an interdisciplinary field that overlaps other disciplines like history, anthropology, archaeology, comparative literature, and not just linguistics. Once the translator has a handle on the meaning and context, he can then endeavor to communicate it meaningfully to the receiving audience. What are the elements of translation? Some of the questions are, is it clear? Is it natural? And is it accurate? First, is it clear? The translator should strive to communicate the original text meaning with clarity and precision. Consider this simple example. ¿Cómo se llama? In Spanish, a literal word-for-word translation would be how yourself call. When was the last time you met someone and asked them how yourself call? Or even how do you call yourself? This is a little better but still unclear. This translation makes no sense to the original or the English audience. A meaning-based translation, however, would read, "What's your name?" Using antiquated words does not do justice to the original text and the contemporary audience. The challenge is always when someone is translating some ambiguous philosophical text, for example, from German to English, then the translation will likely be just as ambiguous. This is precisely why translation of these texts ends up with meanings entirely different from each other and sometimes even contradictory. Second, is it accurate? Accuracy means that the translator should render the meaning of the text as close to the original as possible. This is to ensure that the original text is accurately represented. This means that the translator should pay attention to the literary form, the cultural context, and the historical backdrop. There's a thin line between making the text relevant to the contemporary audience and attempting to be accurate to the original text. Paying attention to the literary form means understanding the rhythm and cadence that the original author has incorporated into the text. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the word register in linguistic terms is the style of language, grammar, and words used to particular situations. And in musical terms, it means all the notes that a musical instrument or a person's voice can produce, from the highest to the lowest. Therefore, a high register is more formal language that is usually in written form, in contrast to a low or informal register refers to conversational language with colloquialisms that are generally not present in academic writing. Third, is it natural? A translation can be clear and accurate, yet not smooth and natural. If translations are hyperliteral, rigid, and do not consider idioms, then the translation will be wooden and unnatural. An idiom is a group of words in a fixed order that has a particular meaning that differs from the meanings of each word on its own. Consider this example. I jump to conclusions. I beat around the bush. I throw my weight around. I dodge responsibilities. I carry things too far. I pass the buck. And I make mountains out of molehills. These are just a few idioms we can use in our common parlance, but translating them word for word will make no sense to the speaker nor the receiving audience. Conclusions. Is the meaning clear? That's the bottom line. If the meaning is not clear to the receiving audience, then the translator has not succeeded. There is no perfect translation. There will never be a translation that is perfect. Translation is a work in progress. The best of translations are translations at best. Finally, translation is an approximation.